The shape of the women's and men's games is completely different. You can see here how many runs per over each of the elite T20 systems and competitions allow throughout a match. And they look kind of similar, but there's one very obvious noticeable difference. After the power play, men's cricket has a significant drop, while the women actually start scoring quicker. To explain all this, you need to know that women's cricket has some key differences that I don't think all fans know about. The obvious one is that the ropes are in more, which is really easy to see and is mentioned a lot. But I think equally important is the fact that the inner ring is smaller. For men, it is 30 yards, for women, 25. This seems to have an impact on how the game is played. For instance, for years there were more runouts in the women's games because they were trying to steal singles, but with all the fielders 5 yards closer. Even recently, Hypercourse has talked about how the new regulations to bring fielders in for slow over rates actually might have a negative impact on the women's game, especially if top order players are not in when it happens. The result is often that the middle and the tail order can't actually capitalize on the extra fielder being in the ring, and instead of being able to score freely, they actually struggle from the fewer gaps to pierce. There's another key difference that I don't think is talked about enough, and that is that the women use a smaller ball. And there are some players like Sophie Devine who thinks they should even have a lighter one yet. But what this really does is it allows for women to bowl spin. With a bigger ball, I think that would really affect them. And there's a reason I'm mentioning this, because in the post-COVID era, about half of all deliveries in the women's game were bowled by spinners. That's a lot more than we see in the men. And the other difference is that in all three phases of the women's game, spin is crucial. Most notably, spinners are some of the best death bowlers in the world. In our preview of the T20 World Cup bowlers, you would have saw that Jess Johnson was mentioned a lot. And I'm still trying to figure out what it is that makes her so special at the death. She is very smart, precise and composed, but there doesn't seem to be any mystery there. But being that it isn't just her, it perhaps has something to do with batters coming in down the order and struggling to power away the spinners. The pace off the ball seems to have a far bigger impact on the women's game where there is less power. And most importantly, you can see women bowl more than double the amount of spin at the death than men do. And yet it's almost exactly the same amount in the power play. This is a big change. And it's not like in the men's game where there are just a couple of spinners who do bowl a lot at the death, and so they make the numbers look bigger. These days, it's very much Rashid Khan. Despite all the T20 he bowls, he's not in the 20 most used death bowlers in the world. So the big difference here is if you are playing women's cricket and batting at the end, you have to be able to play spin. That is not the case with men. In fact, because there is so much spin bowled all the way through women's cricket, you cannot hide from it. If you're not a good player of spin, half the time you're not going to be making any runs. Now, if we just have a look at the phases a little bit more here, the only time that the spinners are worse in a women's match is in the power play. That's interesting because that's the one time the field is up. Even at the death with their high usage, they're still well below anything that seamers can do. And this isn't Asia warping the numbers either, because in these numbers, it's mostly non-Asian franchises, with a little bit of international Asian cricket thrown in there as well. As the PSL and IPL get played more, we might actually see the women's game go more towards spinners. And if you drop the men's games in here, you will see that the pattern is fairly similar. But there are key differences. The men don't score quicker against spin than pace in the power play, for instance, even if the fielder in the circle does play a big part. The other difference is that spin in the middle overs has a far bigger drop in runs per over than it does with women. And you will also see one of my favorite things, that spin at the death has a lower economy than pace, by like a lot. That is partly because spinners only tend to bowl at the death when the wicket is ragging, and also because Rashid Khan bowls most of those overs. But it might also suggest that spin isn't bowled enough at the end. If we go into average, we can see that women's spinners are better in all three parts of the game. Often in the men's game, we see that the average for finger spinners balloons in the middle overs. That doesn't happen for the women. They are wicket-taking machines, and even in the power play, their weakest phase, they are outperforming women swing bowlers, which takes some effort. If we drop the men in here, we see that in terms of average, there is no big advantage for spin or pace all the way through the innings. They are almost identical until spin has a better average at the end. But look at how different the women's lines are. In the women's game, spin is just clearly better in terms of averages, and in the men's game, it's about the same. So remember, women already bowl a lot more spin than men do. And you could look at this and you could argue they could bowl even more. If Australia wanted to, they could pick all three of their leggies, Jess Johnson and Ashley Gardner. And I suppose if they wanted to use a seamer, they could. They might be better if they did this. If we go on to the batters, many of the best women players at the death are anchors, Laura Wolfart, Harmanpreet Kaur and Beth Mooney. Their strategy is very similar to men's ODIs. Knock it around for the first 15 overs with the odd boundary and then party very hard at the death. The difference between men and women's T20 cricket is that the men have a lot of specialist middle order hitters. And as of now, there are very few women who do this. Annabelle Sutherland completely stands out. Rishi Ghosh showed potential for this at the World Cup, but there's probably a lot more development in her power hitting game. But this also explains why the top order batters tend to be more conservative. They want to get to the end because while they're also the best top order players, they're also the best hitters at the death. That's not the case in the men's game. And usually when people talk about women's cricket, they say that the tails are weaker. We had a look at it, and the tail isn't really the problem. It's really around numbers 5 to 7. In the women's game, they only score 17 runs per dismissal at 6.59 per over. So they're not even offering a strike rate trade-off here. That means that there's a lot more pressure on the top order to preserve their wicket in order to score more runs and also score quicker. And if you compare it to the men, you can see that they get a bump in strike rate and average in that section. This is something I expect to improve very soon. But at the moment, women's cricket is far more reliant on their top order batters. And this brings us all to balls per boundary. There is something interesting to note here. We know that the strike rates of women's batters increase in the middle overs. However, it is worth noting that the rate of hitting boundaries takes a significant dip. This implies that strike rotation is far more important in the women's game. But the balls per boundary changing in women's cricket makes absolute sense, as it does in men's cricket. Once you put the fielders out on the rope, you can hit fewer boundaries. However, the interesting thing here is the difference between women's franchise cricket and internationals. Teams tend to field their best bowling attacks in international cricket, so maybe that is why the balls per boundary measure is higher in internationals than franchise. And I should point out that we aren't using all T20 internationals, because obviously the standard changes massively, especially in the women's game, so we're only using teams that qualified for the World Cups. But in the middle overs, the balls per boundary is 17% higher in international cricket than franchise cricket. That is something you do not see in the men's game. Usually almost any trend in franchise cricket in the men's game is matched with international cricket. But all of this brings us back to that first thing that we had a look at. Women score quicker in the overs after the power play than men do. So in the men's game, when you put fielders back, men start hitting the boundaries every 7.5 balls, which is 2 balls more than they do in the power play. And because of that, as you can see here, their run rate is massively slowed. When you do the exact same thing with women, the balls per boundary goes up, which is normal, but instead of the econ going down like men, it also goes up. Women score quicker with fewer boundaries. And this is for me the pattern that is most interesting. This is a completely different form of batting than men's cricket. The men are playing a power game. The women are playing a space game.